What if the real threat to a society isn't poverty, but extreme wealth at the top? That's a question most people today are still afraid to ask seriously. We talk about poverty, we run charities, we debate minimum wages, but very few people stop to examine what happens at the other end of the scale, when wealth and power become so concentrated that the rest of society begins to suffocate beneath it. Most people assume civilizations collapse because they run out of money. Wars get too expensive, natural disasters drain the treasury, foreign enemies breach the walls. We picture collapse as something violent, sudden, and external. But more than 250 years ago, a Muslim scholar living in Delhi saw something different. He watched a great empire disintegrating, not because it had run out of resources, but because those resources had stopped moving. He watched wealth pooling at the top like water filling a sealed tank, while the land beneath cracked from thirst. His name was Shah Waliullah Dehlawi, and the diagnosis he wrote down in 18th century India reads less like a medieval manuscript and more like a warning written for us. He argued that societies begin to decline long before their armies fall or their treasuries empty. They begin to decline when wealth and power stop circulating, when they freeze inside a small, privileged circle at the top, and the rest of society is slowly starved of opportunity. He called this a civilizational disease, not an economic problem, a disease, and the system he described, the dynamics he laid bare, may look surprisingly familiar today. To understand what Shah Waliullah saw, you need to stand where he stood. It is the year 1731. Delhi is still, technically, the center of one of the wealthiest empires on earth. The Mughal throne has controlled the Indian subcontinent for nearly 2 centuries. Its court produces art, architecture, and philosophy that rivals anything happening in Europe at the same moment. The Red Fort gleams. The bazaars overflow with silk, spice, and silver. But something strange was happening beneath the surface. The empire that had once been held together by disciplined administration and formidable military power was beginning to fracture, quietly, invisibly, from within. Emperor after emperor had grown more isolated from reality, more dependent on court favorites, more distracted by palace intrigues. Noblemen competed not for merit, but for proximity to power. Who sat closest to the throne, who received the most lucrative land grants, who could extract the most from the provinces below. Meanwhile, in the villages and towns that fed this empire, people were being ground down by taxation. Farmers who worked the land saw larger and larger portions of their harvest disappear into the hands of revenue collectors. Artisans who crafted goods for trade found themselves squeezed between rising costs and shrinking markets. The roads were becoming dangerous. Trade routes were breaking down. Regional governors who once served the empire were beginning to carve out their own kingdoms. Into this slow-motion collapse walked Shah Waliullah Dehlawi, born in 1703, the son of a respected scholar, educated in the classical Islamic sciences and deeply shaped by his time studying in Mecca and Medina. He returned to Delhi not as a man who had been away from the world, but as a man who had seen the wider world clearly enough to understand what was going wrong at home. He was not a politician. He held no office. He commanded no army. What he had was something more dangerous to the powerful, a clear mind willing to write down exactly what he saw. Unlike many scholars of his era who focused entirely on theology and ritual, Shah Waliullah studied how societies actually function. He studied the relationship between economic life, political power, and moral order. He asked the kind of questions that made comfortable people uncomfortable. Why do powerful civilizations become weak? Why do prosperous societies become unjust? Why do empires decay from within, long before any foreign enemy brings them down? The answers he arrived at were precise, systematic, and deeply human. Shah Waliullah began with a simple observation that had profound consequences. Human beings are not meant to live in isolation. This is not just a religious sentiment. It is a practical reality. No individual human being can produce everything they need to survive. Food, shelter, clothing, tools, knowledge, protection. The complexity of sustaining even a basic human life requires the labor of many different hands. So, societies form. Not because people are naturally kind or selfless, but because cooperation is the only strategy that actually works. A farmer grows more food than he can eat. A craftsman produces more tools than he can use. A teacher accumulates more knowledge than one student can receive. The surplus from each person's specialized contribution flows outward, creating a web of interdependence that makes everyone better off. Think of it like a table. Each leg represents a different kind of contribution. farmers, craftsmen, merchants, teachers, administrators. Each leg bears weight. Each leg matters. The table stands only because all four legs are touching the ground and doing their part. This cooperation, this division of labor and exchange of contributions, is what Shah Waliullah called the foundation of civilization itself. Not wealth, not military power, not even religion. Cooperation. And here is where the story begins to darken, because Shah Waliullah's central question was not simply how do societies form. His central question was more unsettling. What happens when some groups stop contributing but don't stop taking? What happens when one leg of the table lifts off the ground while still demanding to be held up? This is where his economic critique begins, and this is where the story becomes surprisingly modern. Shah Waliullah understood something about power that most people prefer not to think about. Ruling classes almost never begin as parasites. They begin as contributors. In the early days of any civilization, the people who accumulate power tend to do so because they provide something real. Military defense, administrative order, resolution of disputes, coordination of large projects. In the early Mughal period, the emperors and their nobles genuinely performed this function. They built roads and irrigation systems. They maintained law and order across vast territories. They coordinated trade and production. They earned, in some meaningful sense, their privileged position. But something strange was happening as the generations passed. Luxury grows. Each generation of the elite inherits the wealth and position of the one before, but also inherits a lifestyle that demands more. More servants, more mansions, more ceremonial display, more fine fabric, more imported goods, more elaborate celebrations. The court expands, the entourage multiplies, the apparatus of privilege becomes heavier and more expensive with each passing decade. And here is the crucial shift. As the lifestyle becomes more extravagant, the actual contribution to society often becomes smaller. The early emperors rode into battle and made difficult governing decisions. Their descendants sat behind walls of protocol while favorites and court officials made the real decisions, for a price. This is what Shah Waliullah called the parasitic transformation of the elite. Not a sudden betrayal, not a conscious conspiracy. Just a slow, almost invisible drift in which the people who once contributed to the social contract gradually drift away from it, while retaining, and indeed expanding, their claims on its rewards. This was the Mughal Empire that Shah Waliullah was watching. The problem, he was careful to emphasize, was not wealth itself. There is nothing inherently wrong with some people having more than others. The problem was wealth disconnected from productive contribution. Wealth that had become self-perpetuating, generating more wealth not through any useful activity, but simply by virtue of privilege, position, and proximity to power. Shah Waliullah had a profound understanding of what we would today call economic circulation, the idea that the health of an economy is not about how much wealth exists in total, but about how it moves. Think about money the way you think about blood. The heart doesn't just pump blood to store it somewhere. It pumps blood through the entire body, reaching the fingers, the lungs, the brain. If the blood stops circulating, even if the total volume of blood in the body hasn't decreased, the person dies. Limbs go numb, organs fail. The system collapses not because there isn't enough blood, but because the blood has stopped reaching where it needs to go. A healthy economy works the same way. Wealth circulates through trade, investment, employment, and production. A merchant earns profit and uses it to hire workers. Those workers earn wages and spend them at local markets. Market owners invest in more goods. Farmers sell their harvest and repair their tools. The circulation is what creates opportunity, not the mere existence of wealth at any one point in the system. When wealth concentrates, when it pools in the hands of those who are already wealthy, this circulation slows. The farmer no longer has a buyer for his surplus. The craftsman no longer has customers who can afford his goods. The merchant cannot find workers willing to accept wages so low they cannot live on them. The whole system begins to move in slow motion. But Shah Waliullah identified something even more dangerous than wealth simply sitting still. He identified the mechanism by which concentrated wealth actively works to perpetuate itself, by reshaping the rules of the game. When the elite become powerful enough, they begin to influence the systems that distribute opportunity. Which roads get built and where? Which merchants receive favorable treatment in the market? Which families receive land grants from the state? Which young men receive education and advancement through the court? Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the structure of society bends toward protecting those who already have wealth rather than creating pathways for those who don't. Social mobility declines. The son of a powerful nobleman becomes a powerful nobleman. The son of a landless farmer becomes a landless farmer. The gap between these two lives widens not because the nobleman's son is more talented or works harder, but because the system has been quietly arranged to reproduce privilege. At first, this seems harmless. A few families receive more than their share. A few opportunities are reserved for those who already have connections. The overall wealth of the empire appears unchanged, but the real danger is hidden elsewhere, because a society's greatest asset is not its accumulated gold or its land or its armies. Its greatest asset is the energy, creativity, and motivated contribution of all its members. When large portions of a population lose faith that hard work will be rewarded, when they can see clearly that the game is rigged, they stop contributing as fully. The farmer grows only what his family needs, not the surplus the market requires. The craftsman stops innovating, the merchant stops taking risks, and the whole system becomes less productive, less dynamic, less capable of absorbing shocks. Shah Waliullah watched all of this happening around him in 18th century Delhi, and what shocked him most was not the injustice of it. It was how invisible it was, how few people in positions of power could see what was happening right in front of them. There is a cost to extravagance that most people never see because it doesn't appear on any ledger as a line item labeled cost of elite excess. It appears instead in the daily experience of ordinary people, in higher taxes, heavier burdens, and quietly diminishing possibilities. Shah Waliullah traced this chain reaction with remarkable precision. As ruling classes become more extravagant, the machinery of government that serves them becomes more expensive. More court officials must be paid. More soldiers must be employed to protect the estates of the nobility. More administrative layers must be funded to extract resources from the provinces below. The sheer bureaucratic weight of sustaining privilege grows with each generation. And who pays for all of this? Not the nobles, not the court favorites, not the families with land grants and trade monopolies. It is the farmers who pay, the artisans who pay, the small merchants who pay, the people who actually produce the food, make the goods, and move the commerce that keeps the whole structure standing. The productive base of society, the farmers, craftsmen, traders, and laborers, were being asked to support an ever-expanding superstructure of elite consumption that gave them nothing in return. No protection, no investment, no roads or infrastructure that served their needs. Just extraction. And what happens when extraction becomes too heavy? People stop producing the surplus. Why grow more grain than your family needs if the tax collector will simply take it? Why develop a more efficient craft if the surplus will be taxed away? Why take risks in trade if the system of favoritism means those without connections will always be disadvantaged? The economy does not collapse in a dramatic moment. It contracts slowly, quietly. Year by year, the productive potential of society shrinks, not because of drought or plague or war, but because the incentives to produce, to invest, to create have been steadily eroded by a system that extracts without returning. Shah Waliullah identified this as one of the key mechanisms by which prosperous civilizations slowly destroy themselves from within. Economic inequality eventually becomes a political problem, and political problems, left unaddressed, eventually become civilizational disasters. What happened next shocked many observers of the Mughal decline. The empire that had seemed invincible from the outside had already hollowed itself out from within. When the external shocks came, Persian invasions, Afghan raids, regional rebellions, the structure that remained was too brittle to absorb them. It didn't fall because it was attacked. It fell because it was already empty. And this is where the story becomes surprisingly modern. Because Shah Waliullah was not describing 18th century India, he was describing a pattern. A recurring pattern in human history that appears with remarkable consistency across cultures, centuries, and continents. The specific institutions change, the costumes change, the technology changes, but the underlying human dynamics, greed, privilege, the concentration of power, the erosion of opportunity, these remain astonishingly consistent. Look at the world around you. Wealth inequality in many developed nations has reached levels not seen since the Gilded Age of the late 19th century. The gap between what a typical worker earns and what a top executive earns has expanded to ratios that would have seemed surreal to previous generations. But this is not simply about some people having more than others. The more significant issue is the mechanism, the same mechanism Shah Waliullah identified, by which concentrated wealth reshapes the rules of the game. Political lobbying allows those with significant financial resources to influence the very regulations and tax structures that govern their industries. This is not conspiracy theory. It is documented, legal, and openly discussed. The result is what political economists call regulatory capture, where the institutions designed to oversee powerful interests gradually come to serve those interests instead. Corporate concentration in key industries, technology, finance, healthcare, housing, media, has created situations where genuine market competition has been replaced by de facto oligopoly. New entrants cannot compete. Existing players protect their positions not by offering better products, but by lobbying against regulation that might allow competition, or by acquiring potential competitors before they can grow. Housing, in city after city across the world, has become one of the most visible expressions of this dynamic. The people who already own property become wealthier as prices rise. Those who don't own property find themselves priced out of the very cities where economic opportunity exists, spending ever larger portions of their income on rent with no ability to accumulate assets of their own. The gap between those who have and those who don't widens, not because of intelligence or effort or ambition, but because the system rewards prior ownership over current contribution. Ask Shah Waliullah's core questions, updated for the 21st century. Who benefits most from economic growth? In recent decades, the gains from productivity improvements have flowed overwhelmingly to those who already own capital, stocks, real estate, patents, intellectual property, rather than to those whose labor creates the actual goods and services. Who bears the burden during downturns? In the 2008 financial crisis, institutions whose risky behavior caused the collapse received government rescues. The ordinary homeowners whose mortgages were structured to fail received foreclosure notices. Who influences policy? Not the nurse, the teacher, the truck driver, or the small business owner. Policy influence flows to those who can fund campaigns, hire lobbyists, and rotate personnel between government and industry. Who receives protection when crises occur? Every major economic crisis in recent memory has produced bailouts for large institutions deemed too big to fail, while ordinary workers, small businesses, and taxpayers absorbed the costs. The institutions changed. Human behavior did not. This is why Shah Waliullah remains relevant. He was not describing a problem specific to Mughal India or to Islam or to the 18th century. He was describing a problem rooted in human nature itself, in the way that those who accumulate power naturally tend to use that power to accumulate more power, in the way that privilege, left unchecked, expands and entrenches itself, in the way that systems designed to serve everyone gradually bend toward serving only those with enough influence to bend them. The real danger was hidden elsewhere. It was not in the visible spectacle of elite excess. It was in the invisible erosion of trust, opportunity, and social cohesion that happens over years and decades, as ordinary people slowly realize, though they may not be able to articulate exactly why, that the system is not working for them. Shah Waliullah never viewed economics as merely numbers. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about his thought. For him, economic arrangements were not technical questions. They were moral questions. They were questions about what a society values, how it treats its members, and what kind of human beings it produces. When wealth becomes excessively concentrated, something happens that never appears in an economic report. Trust begins to decline. Trust is the invisible infrastructure of any functioning society. We trust that courts are impartial, that regulators enforce rules, that governments represent something larger than the interests of those who fund campaigns. This institutional trust is what allows a modern society to function with any degree of complexity. Shah Waliullah understood that this trust is not durable. It is not self-sustaining. It requires constant renewal through the visible demonstration that the system is just, that it operates with some meaningful relationship to fairness and equal treatment. When that demonstration fails repeatedly, when ordinary people can see clearly that the wealthy receive different treatment, that rules bend for those with connections, that the path to success requires relationships and inheritance rather than simply talent and work, trust erodes. Slowly at first, then faster. Social solidarity weakens. The sense that we are all in this together, that we share a common project, a common future, a common stake in each other's well-being, begins to dissolve. In its place grows resentment, not necessarily violent or dramatic resentment, often just a quiet withdrawal, a turning inward, a loss of willingness to sacrifice for institutions and systems that don't appear to sacrifice for you. And once that cooperative spirit weakens, once people stop feeling themselves to be participants in a shared enterprise, the practical efficiency of the society suffers as well. Not because people become lazy, but because the invisible cooperation that makes complex social organization work begins to break down. Shah Waliullah identified this as the deepest danger of economic inequality. Not the suffering of those at the bottom, as real and urgent as that suffering is, but the systemic damage to the cooperative fabric that allows a civilization to function at all. An economy can survive poverty. Poverty has always existed. Societies have endured famine, plague, and war. But what no society can long endure is the experience of injustice, the widespread sense that the game is rigged, that the rules don't apply equally, that effort and contribution are no longer reliably connected to reward. This transforms inequality from an economic issue into a civilizational issue. It is not simply that some people have less than they deserve. It is that the system has lost the moral authority that makes people willing to cooperate with it. And when a civilization loses that, when enough of its members stop believing that the shared project is actually shared, it has already begun to collapse. The walls may still stand, the markets may still operate, the court may still issue proclamations, but the living tissue that holds it all together has been quietly severed. Shah Waliullah could feel this happening in the Mughal Empire of his time, and he wrote about it with an urgency that suggests he knew what came next. Shah Waliullah did not just diagnose, he believed in solutions. He believed that societies could be reformed, that the cooperative project could be renewed, that wealth could be recirculated, that political systems could be redirected toward the common good. He spent his life teaching, writing, and trying to awaken the people around him to what was happening before it was too late. He wrote that civilizations are strongest when prosperity is broadly shared, not because equality is a romantic ideal, but because broad participation in prosperity is the material foundation of social cohesion. When enough people feel they have something to lose, something to protect, something to contribute to, they become invested in the survival of the system. They cooperate, they build, they defend. But when prosperity becomes narrowly concentrated, when it retreats into a small circle of the privileged while the majority watches from outside, the system loses its most critical resource. Not gold, not military force, not even good laws. It loses legitimacy. And legitimacy, once lost, is almost impossible to restore through force alone. You cannot compel cooperation. You cannot mandate trust. You cannot command the kind of willing participation that makes a civilization dynamic and resilient. These things arise naturally when people believe in the justice of the system they inhabit, and they dissolve when that belief is repeatedly betrayed. Money alone cannot sustain a civilization. Shah Waliullah had watched one of the wealthiest empires in human history prove this. The Mughals did not collapse because India ran out of resources. They collapsed because the system that governed those resources had stopped serving the people it was supposed to serve. Military strength cannot sustain a civilization. History is full of powerful armies that could not hold together societies whose internal cohesion had already dissolved. Political authority cannot sustain a civilization. Laws lose their meaning when those who make them visibly exempt themselves from their consequences. What ultimately sustains civilization, what Shah Waliullah returned to again and again in his writing, is something simpler and more demanding than any of these: justice, opportunity, social trust, and broad participation in prosperity. These are not luxuries, they are structural requirements. Remove them, and the most impressive-looking civilization will hollow out and fall. That feeling, that quiet, corrosive sense of exclusion, is not a soft, cultural phenomenon that concerned thinkers can safely ignore. It is an economic force. It withdraws energy, creativity, effort, and cooperation from the system. It generates political movements, both wise and destructive. It erodes the institutional trust that makes complex coordination possible. And it does all of this slowly, invisibly, until the moment it suddenly becomes visible in a financial crisis, a political rupture, a social explosion that everyone calls sudden, even though the warning signs had been present for decades. Shah Waliullah saw those warning signs lessons in 18th century Delhi. He wrote them down. He warned anyone who would listen. Nearly 3 centuries ago, he warned that civilizations do not collapse simply because the poor have too little. They collapse when the powerful take so much that the bonds holding society together begin to break. The only question that matters, is whether we are paying attention this time.